Well, just a few days ago, we hosted a Dream event, Dream 2021, right here on our campus plaza. And it was absolutely incredible. We actually had a pretty amazing attendance, especially for all of the restrictions that are happening and the folks that weren't able to make it. We were able to social distance, and it was an incredible evening. But we know that there's so many people who invest in our church who simply weren't able to make it out that evening. And I wanted to loop you in to get a chance to experience and hear some of what we talked about at this Dream event, even though you weren't able to be there in person. This has been an insane year that we've been through. That's probably the biggest understatement I think I've ever said. And I'm really good at knowing like what I still need to do, but I'm not that great at celebrating the things that I've already done. In fact, I have this tendency to set really high expectations for myself, both like personally and professionally, and then be really hard on myself in pursuit of those things. Maybe there's something in you that's a little bit like that too. And this can be a particularly brutal way to be during a year when absolutely nothing goes according to plan, which would be 2020. And that's why it's so healthy for us just to kind of stop and remember and celebrate what God has done in our lives and in our church through this past year. Jesus famously said, "Seek and you will find," which is really a way of saying like you tend to locate what you're looking for. And when I actually forced myself to sit down and just think about this last year, I was blown away by all of the good things that God did in the midst of what a lot of us would look at and be like, man, this was such a bad year. And I started having to kind of rethink and reframe the year. There were a lot of bad things that happened, but also God did so much good. I mean, honestly, there was this moment where I was feeling bummed about this whole year, and I pulled out my phone and I started scrolling through our Instagram account, and I was just realizing how much we've done over this past year, how much community outreach, how many people's lives have been impacted, how many stories, how much online content we've produced, how many people we've impacted through different community events and outreach opportunities. And I was overwhelmed. This year, we shifted all of our weekend services online almost overnight. And it was a huge thing to do because at the time, we didn't even have the equipment we needed to produce online content in the way that we ended up doing. And our team scrambled and made it happen. But even through that process, even now, our average online attendance has been roughly over 1,800 majority views per Sunday. And on Easter, we had over 5,200 separate devices log on and view the majority of that service, which is unbelievable. On top of that, we've had 1,350 separate individuals RSVP and participate in in-person services and events and outreach opportunities during COVID. We saw 91 people begin giving for the very first time this year. 257 people this year got into an adult or a student growth group and consistently participated for at least a stretch of time. And even above all that, when we started having outdoor services here on our campus, which we still have now, we've got a 9 a.m., 11 a.m., and 5 p.m. currently, that average attendance is rolling in right at about 244 people, which is about 25% of our pre-COVID numbers. And although that is a much smaller grouping of people than we used to have here, the world has changed. And honestly, according to national averages, that's actually a pretty decent percentage. One of my favorite things to talk about is the fact that we've had 129 people raise their hands and say yes to Jesus this year. That's just on the Corona campus. People whose lives in eternities have been affected because you continued to give and invest in our church, and we continue to stay faithful to our calling. But even if you set all of the services aside, we have done more for our community this year than we ever have before. Like so much that it's impossible for me to list it all. But let me give you again some highlights. We purchased hundreds of meals for medical workers throughout the year. We restocked local food banks and hosted massive distribution events. We bought and installed furniture, bedding, and appliances in the homes of several single mothers. We rallied hundreds of volunteers to serve across multiple campus and community workdays. We hosted several on-campus community blood drives. We provided meals, snacks, gift cards, equipment, and supplies to local teachers, local police, and local firefighters. We resourced local group homes for foster kids. We helped foster care workers by giving them sports equipment, bedding, gifts, and supplies. We gave hundreds of Christmas gifts to children with parents in prison this holiday season. We provided free remote counseling and mental health resources to those struggling with anxiety and depression during quarantine. We hosted several drive-through events and online groups and game nights and prayer meetings and classes and even a late night show. And we made hundreds of personal calls to check in with, talk, and pray for people who have been stuck in their homes during this time. And I'm telling you, this is just scratching the surface. There is too much to tell. And I gotta be honest, I wouldn't really wanna be a part of a church that could fit all of the life change stories that happened in a year into one short little succinct video. And the reason why I feel the need to tell you all these numbers is that every number points to a person. Behind every stat is a story, and every story is significant. And some of those significant stories are yours. It's the story of what God did in your life this year, the story of how God used our church, our campus to impact you and your family. I can't count the number of emails and direct messages and even personal conversations I've had with people in a very serious tone told me I don't know if I would have made it through this season without the connection that I have to my spiritual family. I needed that message. I needed that moment. There's so much gratefulness in the hearts of so many because of the things that we've done. And I'm guessing that maybe there's some of that gratefulness in your heart as well. But if you're like me, it may take a little bit of work to kind of dig it up and uncover it. Maybe like me, it's difficult for you to uncover all of the things that you're grateful for, and what seems to sift to the surface are all the things that you wish you would have done a little bit better, or the things that still need to be improved. And this is what I want to challenge you to do. I want you to think about one way our church has made your life better this year. What's one way that being a part of this church, whether it was in person or online, whether it was a part of our services or groups, whether maybe you just occasionally listened to the podcast and invested in what we were doing from a distance, how has this church impacted your life and made it better? I think it's important for us to tell these stories, even if the person we're telling these stories to is just ourselves or the people that we live with. It's important to remember where we've come from, what God has done in our lives, because honestly, remembering how God provided for us and took care of us behind us, that's what reminds us to dream about all the possibilities that are up ahead of us. And we have some big dreams for what we want to see God do in our lives this next year. But as you're thinking about what God has done in your life, I want you to check out what God has done in the lives of so many at South Hills globally, because our church is not just this campus. It's something much, much bigger. And I want to give you just a small glimpse of how big an impact we've had globally this year. Check this out.
My name is Adam Smith. I am the campus pastor at our South Hills Corona campus, and with me is Moses Camacho, the executive pastor over all of our campuses and the king of South Hills hats. I don't know how many you have, but
one for every outfit.
Amazing collection. We are sitting here in the middle of the Corona Auditorium, which is empty. Part of the reason why we wanted to sit here is that this has been the state of a lot of our auditoriums during this last year.
There definitely has been a lot of loss and a lot of grief in people's hearts and lives, but the reality is there's been a lot of God life-changing stories in 2020. South Hills is not just your campus, wherever city you're in. We actually have 12 locations.
That is crazy to think about.
This year, we opened up our first out-of-state campus in the U.S., South Hills, Idaho. And it's been an amazing story to see what God is doing, the life change that's happening through all of our campuses, whether they're in California, whether it's in Idaho, whether it's outside of the U.S. God has not stopped transforming lives. God has not stopped impacting people and their families through what we've been doing through South Hills.
And we did a lot of big things this year, like that we all pulled our resources to do. And I know one of those big things that we did multiple times was these giant food distribution events.
Our founding pastor, Chris, has a great relationship with Convoy of Hope. And so we started in San Diego, and then we also did a distribution here in Corona, as well as Burbank, Costa Mesa as well. We've fed thousands and thousands, over 2,000 families that have been suffering through this pandemic, that have been not having resources or jobs or food.
We didn't do less. We stepped up and did more. We've offered more service opportunities, not less, more online opportunities, not less.
We've had commitments to Christ in services. We've had commitments to Christ online services, which has been unreal. And we've had baptisms this year in backyards and bathtubs.
People's pools, it's just like
people's
wherever.
pools. Yeah, it has been a year that we can truly sit back, reflect, and look at all the wins that God has allowed us to see only because of South Hills family.
I know a lot of people can think like we haven't had like consistent in-person services all year long, so what have my resources gone to? And, the real answer is a lot of serving and helping and caring for people's practical needs that rippled out into them really starting to ask questions about who God was and who Jesus was and how can I be a part of this spiritual community.
As you know, not too long ago, we showed the life-changing story of Bree from Costa Mesa, who during this time stepped up and started tithing for the first time. I asked her, is it a concern to you at all? What is South Hills doing with my tithe?
Yeah.
And she looked at me and she's like, absolutely not. I've seen this church serve the community like never before. She was just absolutely impressed with what we do as a church with the resources that we have.
It would be impossible for us to list all the different things. It's one of the reasons why we encourage people to follow us on social media, because we do share these stories and things that we've done, but thousands of meals, thousands of hours served, just so many different projects that we have done throughout the year. Every number represents a person.
Absolutely.
And it represents a story, and it represents life change.
Because of the faith that our church has with trusting God with their finances, South Hills continues to be the church with the mission to reach people for Christ. Although church may look different from the inside or the outside, the reality is the South Hills mission and vision of reaching people for Christ and helping people find their Savior and move in a relationship with God, getting closer and closer, trusting Him with every part of their life, and then having us being able to serve the community, that is going to continue.
And we're grateful.
Absolutely.
We're so incredibly grateful. And so thank you for continuing to step up. And as you step up, we're going to continue to step up and do everything that God's called us to do.
Thank you for allowing us to be the church that brings hope into the life of people.
Again, man, when I see that video, I'm just overwhelmed by how much actually happened. And as we said in the video, in that interview, like that's not even everything that happened or God did in our church, in our community just last year. It was just what could fit. In fact, there's this part in the video that like can feel kind of annoying if you're trying to read it all, where Moses is talking about how much God has done in our church, and there's this scrolling kind of Star Wars list of things. And if you're trying to read every single line, it just feels overwhelming. It feels like you can't possibly read it all. And that's kind of the point. That's why it's edited that way, to really reinforce this idea that there's so much that God has done, not just on our campus, but through all of the different places in which we have South Hills churches, in which we have campuses. And in fact, our fingerprints are on communities all over the world. And you've done this. Like your faithfulness and commitment, your giving has made it all possible. But we don't just want to look back, we want to look ahead. And I want to just encourage you to dream with me about some of the things that we really would love to see happen this next year. We want to continue through 2021 to develop long-term relationships with our local outreach partners. We want to continue working to provide in-person opportunities for people to experience hope and community, whether that is our on-campus socially distant growth groups or whether that is our services that we host out on the lawn. We want to develop new and different online strategies in order to help people that are in different places to be able to connect remotely, whether that is a series of online groups. We're working on ways to do our discipleship curriculum online as well at your own pace, and some other ideas that we have that we're working on as well. We want to create more on-ramps for people to develop spiritually, relationally, and financially, doing some budgeting classes, providing some deep-end discipleship tools, and even providing a marriage class this next year. We would really love to see our in-person attendance get back to our pre-COVID numbers. We were really believing that eventually the situation that we're in will lift and shift, and we will be able to see, maybe in a different sort of style, but being able to see us connect with as many people this next year as we did at the beginning of this last year. We have vision to hire a couple more staff members this next year. And, we always have this vision to see a lot more people come to know who Jesus is, to find a deep sense of community, to feel like for the first time, maybe in their whole life, that they feel at home in church, in our community, and they get a sense of who God designed them to be and find that they are loved and accepted for who they are right now and encouraged to grow into all that God has for them. But what about you? Like what are you daring to dream that God might want to do in and through you in 2021? Maybe you're at a place where you're a little bit nervous to dream because you're like, I don't know. It's hard for me to get my hopes up because what if it's not possible? What if it doesn't pan out? And yet I think God places certain dreams in our heart and dares us to chase him, to follow him forward. And sometimes it's not even always getting to the destination of that dream, but having the courage to chase Christ and to run down that path after him and to see what happens in the process. During this year, as we've been talking as a team about what next year is going to look like, we've been saying that, essentially we're going to have to replant our campus. Maybe you're familiar with that term. Like every time we start a new campus here at South Hills, we call it planting. It's like this imagery of digging up the dirt and putting in a small seed or a seedling. And you're not starting with nothing, but you're starting with something very small. And you're allowing something, you're nurturing something for its roots to grow down deep and for it to spring up and gain new life and for it to take on and grow and become healthy. It's a process. And in a lot of ways, we're going to have to replant our campus, a campus that is 21 years old. We're going to replant this next year. And what we mean by that is in a lot of ways, we're going to have to start over. Like we had this really lush thing that was planted, like the seedling that Chris Songson, our founding pastor, originally planted over this last year, because of a lot of what's happened in our culture has been blown down or blown over. We're going to have to re-recruit volunteers. We're going to have to retrain leaders. We're going to have to reacquaint people with what it looks like to begin coming in person again regularly. We're going to have to recast vision of the kind of church that we are, the kind of church that we're not. We're going to have to rebuild what we've lost. And it would be dishonest of me to tell you all the good that happened this last year and to ignore the loss. And there's been a lot of loss. We've lost a lot, individually, collectively, communally. Like our church, our campus is not what it once was. And that could be heartbreaking to realize that our attendance in person is 25% of what it was before. To look at our giving records and realize that despite the new givers and the consistency and the faithfulness of many, that our overall giving has dropped by about 25-30% for the year. Just being honest about the fact that there are ministries that we want to initiate, to continue, that we'll have to cut if our giving doesn't pick up in the next year. These are realities that we have to face. Like, we have the small staff we have because it's what we can afford at the time. We're doing the things we're doing because it's what we can afford to do at the time. And I got to tell you, like, our limitations don't affect my dreams. I dream big, our staff dreams big, but it takes big resources to be able to fund big vision. And this is my hope for you, that you would join us in the process of replanting and all that that entails, that you would sow your life into what it's going to mean to replant and rebuild our church. There's this story in the Bible where God's people had settled in the promised land, like everything was great. And they planted these vineyards and these orchards, and they prospered, and they were like harvesting a lot, and everything was amazing, and they got used to it, right? And then in an instant, it all burned down, like literally. These people were attacked and their land was overtaken, and a lot of people were killed. They were hauled off, and these people found themselves overthrown by the Babylonians, and everything that they'd built had been torn to the ground. They'd been hauled off into slavery, and they went from having everything to feeling like they had barely anything, like everything had been taken from them. And they pleaded with God to give them their old lives back. And they, of course, they wanted everything they had before, and they wanted it right now, and they wanted it immediately overnight. And this feels like us. I mean, sometimes I look around at what our church is, and although I'm grateful for where we're at, there's a frustration of like, I liked the way it was. It was awesome pre-COVID, and we were going somewhere, and we had momentum, and it was so amazing to see so many different, diverse people gather together and worship God and grow in their faith. And things have changed. And I find myself at times like wishing that God would just make it like it was overnight. And that's what these people wanted. In fact, they wanted things to change instantly, or they were just going to they wanted just to leave. And this is what God told them to do. Stay, plant gardens, eat the food they produce. Don't dwindle away. Work for the peace and prosperity of the city where I sent you, and pray to the Lord for it. It wasn't what they wanted to hear. Maybe it's not what you want to hear. But I've got to tell you, anytime you pray for a miraculous harvest, God will always respond by telling you to plant. You know, we don't always like that response because planting is slow and steady work. Like, it's a process, which means it takes a lot of time, effort, and energy, and it's impossible to do without getting your hands dirty. And I got to tell you, the reality of this next year for us as a church is that it's not going to be like it was. At least not at first, maybe not for a long while. It can't be. But if we want to grow forward as a church, we're all going to have to pitch in. We're going to have to sow new seed. We're going to have to cultivate the soil. It's going to be a lot of backbreaking, sweaty, sacrificial work. And that's what I want to invite you into. In fact, that's the thing I think that makes church so amazing. It's not this performance that we come and sit through. It's this thing that we gather together and partner together to create. It's this giant gardening project that we all get to throw in on. And you have your part, and I have mine. And it's all significant. And if we do it well, God takes what we give and what we do and uses it to tell amazing stories that we couldn't tell without him or each other. And so this is my challenge to you. I want to ask you this, like, what seed are you going to sow this next year? Like, what do you want to give? What are your giving goals next year? What seed are you going to sow in the future of South Hills? What sacrifices are you going to make? You know, it's impossible to give something away without giving something up. And so what is it that you're going to look into your life and maybe set aside or downsize or do differently so that you can make an investment into our church and the impact that we want to have on this community? And what soil are you going to sweat over? There's lots of different ways to serve and sweat alongside us. There are ways to do it online, there are ways to do it at home and here in person. But I want you to think about and wrestle with what it might look like to really devote yourself to put some sweat equity into the replanting of our campus. Because I think the vision God has for our church next year is as big, if not bigger, than it has ever been. I'm believing for big things. Thank you so much for what you've given and for what you're going to allow God to challenge you to give up ahead. I love you guys. I'm excited to eventually see you again in person. Have an incredible end of this year as we get ready for the next.